The vanishing cabin. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, drenching the narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forests of northern Maine. Jake Williams, a seasoned outdoorsman and amateur photographer, had always enjoyed the solitude that these remote areas offered. The allure of the unknown, the untouched wilderness, and the peace that came with being completely alone in nature was what drew him out here every few months. But this time, the solitude felt different, more oppressive, more suffocating. Jake had been planning this trip for weeks. He had found an old hand-drawn map in a dusty corner of a local bookstore, which marked a small abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was supposedly built by a hermit in the early 1900s and had been forgotten by most. For Jake, it was a perfect subject for his photography, a slice of forgotten history hidden away from the world. The drive had been uneventful, but as he ventured deeper into the wilderness, the sense of isolation grew stronger. The last town he passed was miles behind him, and the road had gradually become less of a road and more of a muddy, potholed trail. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. The only sounds were the steady patter of rain on the roof of his truck and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. Jake had always enjoyed the rain. It added a certain moodiness to his photos and brought a sense of calm. But today, the rain seemed relentless, more of a hindrance than an asset. It blurred his vision through the windshield and turned the dirt road into a slick, treacherous path. He knew he was close to the cabin, at least according to the map, but the road was becoming nearly impassable, and he hadn't seen any signs of the cabin or even a clearing where it might be. He slowed the truck to a crawl, squinting through the rain-soaked windshield. The wipers were working overtime, but the downpour was so heavy that it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Jake's GPS had lost signal about 30 minutes back, and his cell phone was useless out here. He was relying solely on the map, which was now soggy and difficult to read. After what felt like an eternity of creeping forward, he finally saw something through the trees. A small, overgrown path branched off from the main trail, nearly hidden by the underbrush. It was narrow, barely wide enough for his truck, but it was the first sign of anything remotely resembling a trail in miles. He decided to take the chance. The truck bumped and jolted as he carefully navigated the overgrown path. Branches scraped against the sides, and the undergrowth crunched under the tires. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making the path even more precarious. Jake's heart raced with a mix of excitement and unease. If the cabin was at the end of this trail, it would be worth the struggle. But if he got stuck out here, it could be hours, or even days, before anyone found him. After another 10 minutes of slow, nerve-wracking progress, the trees finally began to thin out, and Jake caught his first glimpse of the cabin. It was exactly as he had imagined. Small, weathered, and almost completely swallowed by the forest. The roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. The windows were dark, their glass long since broken or clouded over with grime. Jake parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. He sat there for a moment, just staring at the cabin. It was eerie to say the least, but also fascinating. This was exactly the kind of place he had hoped to find, isolated, forgotten, and untouched by time. He grabbed his camera from the passenger seat and pulled on his rain jacket. The air was cold and damp as he stepped out of the truck, the mud sucking at his boots with every step. He slung the camera around his neck and made his way toward the cabin, the old wooden steps creaking ominously under his weight. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its rusted hinges. Jake hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, the wood groaning in protest. The inside of the cabin was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the details. It was a single room, sparsely furnished with a few pieces of decrepit furniture. A small table, a chair, and a bed frame with a moldy mattress. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty, though a few held old dusty jars and tin cans. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Jake shivered, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. The atmosphere inside the cabin was heavy, almost oppressive. He tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the task at hand, capturing the essence of this forgotten place with his camera. He spent the next hour photographing the cabin from every angle. The rain continued to pour outside, creating a constant background noise that only added to the eerie ambience. The light was dim, but Jake managed to capture some decent shots, using the natural shadows to his advantage. The cabin was a perfect subject, hauntingly beautiful in its isolation and decay. But as he worked, that sense of unease grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was an irrational thought. He was miles from the nearest town, and the cabin had clearly been abandoned for years. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his photography. But then he heard something that made him stop cold. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable. A soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened intently, every muscle tense. The cabin was old, and it could have been the wind or the building settling, but it didn't feel like that. He slowly turned, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the shadows in the corners seemed darker, more solid. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he took a cautious step toward the door. Every instinct was telling him to leave, to get out of the cabin and back to the safety of his truck. But as he reached for the doorknob, he heard the sound again, louder this time, a distinct creak coming from the far side of the room. Jake's pulse quickened. He swung his camera around, using the lens to zoom in on the dark corner where the sound had come from. He snapped a photo, the flash briefly illuminating the room. But the light only served to deepen the shadows, making the darkness seem even more impenetrable. He took a step back, his mind racing. He knew he had to leave, but something held him there, a morbid curiosity mixed with fear. He raised the camera again, focusing on the same spot, and took another photo. This time, the flash revealed something, a shape, barely visible in the darkness. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was there, a dark, indistinct figure lurking in the shadows. He lowered the camera, squinting into the darkness, but he couldn't make out any details. The room was too dark, the shadows too deep. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in on him. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, the air growing colder by the second. Panic welled up inside him, and he turned to the door, ready to bolt. But before he could move, he heard it again, a creak, followed by a slow, deliberate footstep. Jake's heart was racing now, adrenaline surging through his veins. He could feel the presence in the room with him, something cold and malevolent. He didn't dare look back as he reached for the door, his hand trembling. He yanked it open and stumbled outside, the cold rain hitting him like a slap to the face. He didn't stop to look back as he ran to his truck, his boots slipping in the mud. He could still hear the creaking footsteps behind him, growing louder with each passing second. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. For a moment, he just sat there, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain was pounding on the roof, the sound almost deafening. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, standing at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing there, just the empty cabin, shrouded in rain and darkness. Jake's hands were still trembling as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored the accelerator, tearing out of the clearing and back onto the muddy trail. He didn't care about the road, didn't care about the rain or the mud. He just needed to get as far away from that cabin as possible. The drive back was a blur. The rain continued to pour, the road barely visible through the windshield. But Jake didn't slow down. His mind was racing. The images of the cabin and the dark figure burned into his memory. What had he seen? Was it real? Or was it just a trick of the light? A product of his own fear? He didn't have any answers, and he wasn't sure he wanted them. All he knew was that he never wanted to go back to that cabin again. By the time he reached the nearest town, the rain had let up, but Jake was still shaking. He pulled into a gas station, the bright lights a welcome relief after the darkness of the forest. He sat there for a long moment, just breathing, trying to calm his racing heart. Finally, he reached for his camera, eager to review the photos he had taken. Maybe, he thought, he had imagined it all. Maybe the photos would show nothing out of the ordinary, just an old, abandoned cabin. But as he scrolled through the images, his heart sank. The photos were dark, the shadows deep, but in the last few shots, he could see it. A figure, barely visible, standing in the corner of the cabin. It was tall, its features obscured by darkness, but it was there, unmistakable. Jake felt a cold chill run down his spine. He quickly turned off the camera and shoved it back into his bag, not wanting to see any more. He knew he should delete the photos, erase the evidence of whatever had been in that cabin, but something stopped him. Curiosity, maybe, or fear. Either way, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he started the truck and drove away, leaving the gas station and the town behind. He didn't stop until he was back in the city, surrounded by the safety of streetlights and people. But even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, that the darkness of the cabin had somehow attached itself to him. For weeks, Jake was haunted by the memory of the cabin. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything else. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark figure standing in the corner watching him. The photos remained on his camera, untouched, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them again. He stopped going on trips, stopped exploring the wilderness he had once loved. The fear was always there, lurking in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of what he had seen, or thought he had seen, in that cabin. It wasn't until months later, when he finally decided to delete the photos, that he found the courage to confront his fear. He sat down with the camera, his hands shaking, and scrolled through the images one last time. But as he did, something strange happened. The photos were gone. Every image he had taken that day. Every shot of the cabin and the dark figure had disappeared. The camera's memory was wiped clean, as if the photos had never existed. Jake stared at the empty screen, a mix of relief and confusion washing over him. Had it all been in his head? Had the camera malfunctioned? Or had something else, something beyond his understanding, erased the evidence of that day? He didn't have any answers, and he wasn't sure he wanted them. All he knew was that he never wanted to think about that cabin again. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain is falling and the world is dark and quiet, Jake finds himself thinking about the cabin, about the dark figure, the oppressive silence, and the sense of being watched. He wonders if it's still out there, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon it. And in those moments, he can't help but feel a cold chill run down his spine, as if the darkness is still with him, watching, waiting, just out of sight. The lonesome gas station. The sound of rain pattering against the windshield was almost hypnotic as Mark Gibson drove down the desolate highway. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico. The endless stretches of barren land and the occasional cluster of twisted, wind-beaten trees were all that kept him company on this lonely road. He had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the wet pavement his only solace. His destination was still miles away, and he was running low on gas. The nearest town was nowhere in sight, and his GPS had lost signal hours ago, leaving him to rely on his instincts and the faint hope that he'd stumble upon a gas station soon. Mark was a traveling salesman, used to long, solitary drives across the country. He had always enjoyed the freedom of the open road, the sense of adventure that came with each new journey. But this trip felt different. There was something unsettling about the isolation, the way the landscape seemed to stretch on endlessly with no sign of life. Even the weather seemed to conspire against him, the rain falling in relentless sheets, making the road ahead nearly impossible to see. As the needle on the gas gauge dipped closer to empty, Mark's anxiety began to rise. He couldn't afford to be stranded out here, not with no cell service and no idea where the nearest town was. The thought of spending the night in his car, alone in the middle of nowhere, sent a shiver down his spine. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. At first, Mark thought it might be his eyes playing tricks on him, but as he drove closer, the glow took shape. A small, flickering neon sign, barely visible through the rain. The letters were worn and faded, but he could just make out the word GAS in dim, flickering light. Relief washed over him as he guided his car off the highway and onto the narrow dirt road that led to the gas station. The tires skidded slightly in the mud, but Mark didn't care. He was just glad to have found a place to refuel and maybe stretch his legs for a bit. As he pulled into the gas station's lot, he noticed how old and run down the place looked. The building was small, barely more than a shack, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The gas pumps were ancient, the kind that still had mechanical dials instead of digital readouts. The rain drummed steadily on the car's roof as Mark parked next to one of the pumps and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, staring at the gas station through the rain-soaked windshield. Something about the place felt off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The isolation, perhaps, or the way the building seemed to hunch against the storm as if it were trying to hide from the world. Mark shook off the unease and stepped out of the car, pulling his jacket tight against the rain. The air was cold and damp, and the ground squelched under his boots as he made his way to the pump. He lifted the nozzle and inserted it into his car's gas tank, expecting the familiar sound of fuel flowing, but nothing happened. He tried again, but the pump remained silent. Frustrated, Mark looked around for any sign of life. The station seemed deserted, no attendant in sight, and the windows of the small building were dark. He was about to give up and try the next pump when he noticed a faint light flickering inside the building, as if someone had just turned on a lamp. "Hello," Mark called out, his voice barely audible over the rain. There was no response, but the light inside the building continued to flicker. Deciding he had no other choice, Mark walked toward the door, the wooden steps creaking ominously under his weight. He pushed the door open, and a small bell tinkled above his head, announcing his presence. The interior of the gas station was just as old and rundown as the outside. The walls were lined with dusty shelves, stocked with a sparse assortment of snacks, drinks, and automotive supplies that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The floor was scuffed and stained, and the smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellowish light that barely illuminated the room. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, his face wrinkled and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. His clothes were old and threadbare, his hands knobby and twisted with age. He watched Mark with a steady, unblinking gaze as he approached the counter. "Evening," Mark said, forcing a polite smile. "I tried to fill up outside, but the pump isn't working. Do you know if there's another pump that's operational?" The old man didn't respond right away. He simply stared at Mark, his eyes boring into him, as if he were trying to read his thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally spoke, his voice dry and raspy like the creak of old wood. "Pump's been finicky lately," he said. "You might have to try again. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't." Mark frowned, the unease from earlier creeping back into his mind. "Is there another station nearby, in case this one doesn't work?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Nearest station's a good 50 miles from here. You won't make it on what you've got left in your tank." Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. The last thing he wanted was to be stranded out here. "All right, I'll give it another try, thanks." He turned to leave, but before he could reach the door, the old man spoke again. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Might be best to wait it out here for a bit. We don't get much traffic through these parts. Safer to stay off the road until the rain lets up." Mark hesitated. The idea of staying in this creepy, run-down gas station didn't appeal to him, but the thought of driving further into the storm with no guarantee of finding another station was even less appealing. "Thanks, but I'd really like to get back on the road," Mark replied, trying to keep his tone light. "I'll just fill up and be on my way." The old man didn't argue, but his eyes followed Mark as he left the building, making the hair on the back of Mark's neck stand on end. Outside, the rain had intensified, falling in heavy sheets that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Mark hurried back to his car, trying the pump again with no success. Frustration and a growing sense of dread gnawed at him. He didn't want to go back inside and ask for help, but it seemed he had no choice. As he walked back toward the building, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a loud crack of thunder that made him jump. When he stepped inside, the old man was still standing behind the counter, as if he hadn't moved an inch. His eyes followed Mark's every move, unblinking and intense. "Pump's still not working," Mark said, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. "Is there anything you can do to get it going?" The old man tilted his head slightly, as if considering Mark's request. Then, without a word, he reached under the counter and pulled out an old rusted key. He held it out to Mark, his expression unreadable. "Out back," the old man said. "There's a generator. Sometimes it needs a kick to get the pumps working. You'll find the shed behind the station. Use this key." Mark took the key, his fingers brushing against the old man's rough, calloused hand. A shiver ran through him at the touch, but he ignored it, eager to get back on the road. "Thanks," Mark said, turning toward the door. "I'll see what I can do." The rain had let up slightly as Mark made his way around the side of the building, the muddy ground sucking at his boots. The back of the gas station was even more run down than the front, with broken windows and piles of rusted junk strewn about. He spotted the shed the old man had mentioned, a small, dilapidated structure with a sagging roof and a door barely hanging on its hinges. He approached the shed, the key clutched tightly in his hand. As he inserted it into the lock, he hesitated, a strange feeling of unease washing over him. Something about this whole situation didn't feel right. The deserted gas station, the odd behavior of the old man, the strange, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over the place like a dark cloud. But he pushed the feeling aside. He didn't have time for superstitions or gut feelings. He needed to get the generator working, fill up his car, and get out of there. The key turned easily in the lock, and Mark pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the shed was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of oil and mildew. He could just make out the outline of the generator in the dim light, a hulking, ancient machine covered in dust and grime. Mark stepped inside, his footfalls echoing in the small space. He fumbled with the flashlight on his phone, finally getting it to work, and shone the beam over the generator. It was old, older than anything he'd seen in a long time, with exposed wires and rusted parts that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. "Great," Mark muttered to himself. "This thing probably hasn't run since the 50s. He circled the machine, trying to figure out how to get it started. There was a pull cord on the side, and he gave it a tentative tug. The cord resisted at first, then gave way with a jerky motion, but the generator remained silent. Mark pulled harder, gritting his teeth as he yanked on the cord. After several tries, the generator finally sputtered to life, coughing and wheezing like an asthmatic old man. The light flickered, then steadied, casting a faint glow over the shed. For a moment, Mark felt a sense of triumph. He'd managed to get the ancient machine working. But then, as the generator hummed and vibrated, a strange noise cut through the air, a low, guttural moan, like the sound of something in pain. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. The sound wasn't coming from the generator. It was coming from outside the shed, somewhere in the darkness. He turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the cluttered interior of the shed. The noise came again, louder this time, closer. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world, a sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. He took a step toward the door, his instinct screaming at him to run, to get out of there as fast as he could. But before he could move, The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging the shed into darkness. Panic surged through him as he lunged for the door, his hands scrabbling for the handle. But it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, or locked, or something. He threw his weight against it, but it didn't move. "Hey, open the door!" Mark shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. There was no response, just the steady hum of the generator and that awful low moan echoing outside. He pounded on the door, yelling for help, but all he could hear was the sound of his own desperate breathing. And then, suddenly, the moaning stopped. The silence was even more terrifying, the absence of noise more unsettling than the sound itself. Mark stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness pressed in on him, suffocating, as he strained to hear anything, any sign of life outside the shed. A minute passed, then another. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the generator. Mark's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone, trying to find the flashlight app again. The screen flickered on, casting a weak light that did little to dispel the darkness. He turned back to the door, his mind racing. If he couldn't get out, he'd have to find another way. Maybe there was a window, or a weak spot in the wall he could break through. He scanned the interior of the shed, the beam of his phone light sweeping over the old tools and machinery scattered around. And then, in the corner of the shed, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the shadows, was a figure. A dark, indistinct shape, hunched over in the corner. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he slowly raised the phone, the light illuminating the figure. It was a man, or what was left of one. His body twisted and deformed, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, but they were empty, lifeless. Mark stumbled back, his hand covering his mouth to stifle a scream. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if the man had been frozen in place, locked in some horrific state between life and death. He turned and bolted for the door, desperation giving him the strength to shove it open. The wooden plank splintered under the force, and Mark stumbled out into the rain, his breath coming in panicked gasps. The darkness outside was almost as suffocating as the shed, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away, to put as much distance between himself and that awful place as possible. He sprinted back to his car, his boots slipping in the mud as he ran. The old man was still standing behind the counter, his expression unchanged, as if he hadn't heard the commotion outside. Mark didn't stop to explain. He just jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the accelerator. The car skidded on the wet pavement as he tore out of the gas station, the neon sign flickering behind him like a distant memory. The rain was still falling, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away, to put as much distance as he could between himself and that cursed place. It wasn't until he was miles down the road that he finally began to calm down. His hands were still shaking, his heart still racing, but the terror was starting to ebb, replaced by confusion and disbelief. What had he seen? Was it real, or had his mind been playing tricks on him? He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old man standing in the road, watching him. But there was nothing there, just the empty highway stretching out behind him, disappearing into the rain. Mark didn't stop driving until he reached the next town. A small cluster of buildings huddled against the storm. He pulled into the first gas station he saw, his nerves still frayed, but grateful to see other people, to hear the sound of life around him. As he filled up his tank, He tried to make sense of what had happened. The old gas station, the strange old man, the figure in the shed. None of it made any sense. He considered going back, but the thought filled him with dread. There was no way he was going near that place again. As he paid for his gas, the attendant, a friendly-looking woman in her 40s, noticed his uneasy demeanor. "You okay, hon?" she asked, concern in her voice. Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a bit of a scare on the road." The woman nodded sympathetically. "It happens out here, especially in this weather. These roads can be spooky when you're all alone." Mark forced a smile and thanked her. But as he got back into his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something about that gas station, that old man, and the figure in the shed. It felt like something out of a nightmare, but it had been all too real. As he drove away, he made a silent vow to himself. No more lonely roads in the middle of nowhere. No more taking chances with strange, deserted places. There were some mysteries better left unsolved. Some roads better left untraveled. But despite his best efforts to forget, the memory of that night would stay with Mark for years to come. The lonesome gas station, the old man's unblinking stare, and the twisted figure in the shed would haunt his dreams. A reminder that some places in this world hold secrets best left undisturbed. The watcher in the woods, the rain fell in a steady, relentless downpour as Sarah Stevens navigated her car through the winding backroads of western Pennsylvania. She had left the interstate hours ago, following a shortcut suggested by her GPS. It was supposed to save her time. But now, deep in the heart of the Allegheny National Forest, she was starting to regret that decision. The narrow road was barely more than a gravel path, cutting through dense woods that seemed to close in on her from all sides. The trees, tall and ancient, formed a thick canopy overhead, blocking out most of the daylight. What little light filtered through was muted and grey, casting eerie shadows across the road. The rain made everything slick and treacherous, and Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Her cell phone had lost signal over an hour ago, leaving her completely isolated. The thought of being stranded out here, miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help, sent a shiver down her spine. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the road ahead. She was a seasoned traveler, used to long drives and unfamiliar routes. This was just another adventure, she told herself, and she'd be back on the main road soon enough. But as the minutes turned into hours, Sarah began to doubt her resolve. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning through the forest with no signs of civilization in sight. The rain, which had started as a gentle drizzle, was now coming down in heavy sheets, making it almost impossible to see. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the tires skidded on the muddy gravel with every turn. Sarah squinted through the rain-soaked windshield, searching for any sign of life. A house, a gas station, anything. But there was nothing. Just the endless forest and the winding road, disappearing into the misty distance. She was starting to feel the strain of the drive. Her eyes were tired, her muscles tense, and the monotony of the rain and the road was wearing on her nerves. She needed to stop, to rest. but there was nowhere to pull over. The road was too narrow, the shoulders too steep, and the forest too thick. She had no choice but to keep going. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally saw something ahead. A small clearing just off the road. It wasn't much, just a patch of dirt and gravel surrounded by trees, but it was enough. She pulled over, the car sliding slightly in the mud as she came to a stop. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. The silence inside the car was almost deafening after the constant noise of the road. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the thought of getting out of the car in this weather was far from appealing. But she needed to stretch her legs to clear her head before continuing on. She grabbed her jacket from the passenger seat and pulled it on, bracing herself for the cold and wet. The air was thick with moisture as she stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through her jacket and jeans. She shivered, pulling the collar up around her neck as she walked a few steps away from the car. The clearing was eerily quiet. The sound of the rain muffled by the dense trees surrounding her. The forest was dark and foreboding, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Sarah glanced around, trying to get her bearings, but there was nothing to see, just trees and shadows stretching out in all directions. She took a deep breath, the cool, damp air filling her lungs. There was something oddly peaceful about the isolation, a sense of being completely alone in the world. But that peace was fleeting, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The longer she stood there, the more aware she became of the silence. The kind of silence that pressed in on you, that made you feel like you were being watched. Sarah turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Just the same dark shapes, the same shadows. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She could feel ice on her, hidden somewhere in the gloom, watching her every move. Her heart began to pound in her chest as she took a step back toward the car. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees creak ominously. She was about to turn and make a dash for the car when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the snap of a twig. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She listened, straining to hear over the sound of the rain. There it was again, a faint rustling, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Something was out there, moving through the trees. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the sound of the rain and the wind. But the rustling continued, growing closer, more deliberate. Sarah's mind raced, trying to rationalize what she was hearing. Maybe it was an animal, a deer, or a raccoon. But deep down, she knew it was something else, something that didn't belong in the natural world. Panic began to set in as the rustling grew louder, the sound of something or someone moving through the underbrush. Sarah backed up, her eyes darting around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest was too dark, the shadows too deep. She turned and bolted for the car, her heart pounding in her chest. Her boots slipped in the mud as she ran, the rain stinging her face. She reached the car, yanked open the door, and threw herself inside, slamming the door shut behind her. For a moment, she just sat there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands shaking. She locked the doors, her eyes glued to the windshield, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But the clearing was empty, just the same dark shapes and shadows, the same rain-soaked trees. She fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as she started the engine. The car roared to life, the headlights cutting through the gloom. Sarah didn't waste any time. She threw the car into gear and sped back onto the road, the tires kicking up mud and gravel as she fled the clearing. The road twisted and turned through the forest, but Sarah didn't slow down. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding as she tried to process what had just happened. She had felt something out there, something watching her, following her. But there had been nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. It didn't make sense. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the road behind her. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind her, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah drove on, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, her eyes scanning the road ahead. The rain was still falling, the forest still pressing in on all sides, but the feeling of being watched had lessened. She tried to focus on getting back to the main road, on finding her way out of this endless maze of trees and shadows. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision, sent a jolt of fear through her. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. After what felt like hours of driving, Sarah finally saw something ahead. A sign, barely visible through the rain. She squinted, trying to make out the words. It was old and weathered, the paint faded and peeling, but she could just make out the name of a town and an arrow pointing to the left. Relief washed over her as she turned onto the new road, leaving the narrow gravel path behind. The road was wider, more well-maintained, and she could see the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. She was finally back on track, finally on her way out of the forest. But as she drove, the sense of unease didn't leave her. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following her. The road was empty, the rain still falling, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Finally, she reached the outskirts of a small town. The lights of the houses and businesses were a welcome sight after the endless darkness of the forest. Sarah pulled into a gas station, her nerves still frayed, but grateful to be back in civilization. She parked under the bright lights of the gas station and took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The rain had finally let up, and the sound of the drops hitting the pavement was almost soothing after the hours of driving through the storm. She stepped out of the car, feeling a sense of relief as she stretched her legs. The gas station was small but clean, with a brightly lit convenience store and a row of pumps. It was a far cry from the dark, oppressive forest she had just escaped. Sarah walked into the convenience store, the warm air and the smell of coffee immediately putting her at ease. The clerk behind the counter gave her a friendly nod as she approached. "Rough night out there?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "You could say that," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "I think I got a little lost out in the woods." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Out in the Alleghenies? Yeah, that can happen. Those roads are tricky, especially in this weather. You should have come through the main highway." "I was following my GPS," Sarah explained. "It led me down this back road, and before I knew it, I was in the middle of nowhere." The clerk chuckled. "Yeah, that'll happen. Those GPS units don't always know the best routes, especially out here." But you made it. That's what counts. Can I get you anything? Coffee, snacks? Sarah nodded. Coffee would be great. Thanks. As the clerk prepared her coffee, Sarah couldn't help but glance out the window, her eyes scanning the dark parking lot. The feeling of being watched had faded, but it hadn't completely disappeared. She felt safer here, surrounded by lights and people, but she couldn't shake the memory of the forest, the shadows, and the feeling of ice on her. When the clerk handed her the coffee, Sarah took a grateful sip, the warmth spreading through her, calming her nerves. Thanks, she said, her voice more steady. I really needed this. No problem, the clerk replied. Just glad you made it out okay. The woods can be spooky, especially at night. Sarah nodded, taking another sip of coffee. Yeah, they really can. As she left the store and walked back to her car, Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. The worst was behind her, she told herself. She was back on the road, back in the safety of civilization. But as she started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The road was empty, the gas station lights glowing faintly in the distance as she drove away. But the feeling of unease lingered, a subtle, nagging sensation at the back of her mind. It was as if something from the forest had followed her, something that wasn't quite finished with her yet. Sarah tried to shake off the thought as she drove through the small town, her eyes scanning the road ahead. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear, revealing a few faint stars. The town was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive forest she had left behind. But as she reached the edge of town and turned onto the main highway, a chill ran down her spine. There, in the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of something. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the road, just at the boundary where the town lights faded into darkness. It was only for a second, just a fleeting image, but it was enough to send a surge of fear through her. She blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the empty road behind her. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She drove on, her mind racing, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. Just her imagination playing tricks on her after a long, stressful night. But the image of the shadowy figure stayed with her, a haunting reminder of the night she had spent lost in the woods. As she continued down the highway, the lights of the town fading in the distance, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, had returned stronger than ever. And though she knew she was far from the forest, far from the shadows and the oppressive silence, the fear remained, a cold, gnawing fear that told her she hadn't escaped after all. The watcher in the woods was still with her, somewhere out there in the darkness, waiting, watching, following. And Sarah knew deep down that she would never be truly free of it.